Thank you for attending the 2020 Sunstone Digital Symposium Session 123 titled Conversations with Charlotte, England. The audio from this session will be available for purchase at sunstone.org after the symposium. The video recording of this session will be available in the Whova app for approximately 3 months beginning at the end of August 2020. At Sunstone, we are making it a goal to build a community that allows many ways for people to express their faith. Our tagline is, "There is more than one way to Mormon." We invite you to help us build a community where all paths are given space to be better understood. Please support us in our mission by making a donation and subscribing at sunstone.org. About this presentation. In honor of Jean England's 88th birthday on the 22nd of July, this session will recall a conversation of some years ago facilitated by Jay Griffith between Jean's widow, Charlotte England, and Jay's neighbor and friend, Jim McConkie. Jim was a close nephew to Bruce R. McConkie and had long wished to apologize for his uncle's harsh letter and the silencing of Jean many years prior due to several of Jean's teachings and beliefs. The initial piece of this presentation was recorded via Zoom a week before the conference on his birthday. The Q&A for the live session had to be abandoned due to technical difficulties in the first half and was replaced with a second Zoom conversation we recorded several days after Sunstone. I'd like a second to introduce you to our speakers before we begin. Charlotte England is an artist and writer and is the forever companion of Jean. She looks forward to the time when she can again host dinners and conversations face to face. She and her family enjoy traveling to England with students via study abroad. Jim McConkie is a Salt Lake City civil rights attorney. He taught in the CES program for over 15 years with his wife, Judith. He is the author of Looking at the Doctrine and Covenants Again for the Very First Time, and joint author with his wife, Judith, of the book Whom Say Ye That I Am? Lessons from the Jesus of Nazareth. Jim is co-founder of the Refugee Justice League with his partner, Bradley H. Parker, a group of over 800 lawyers who donate their time to represent refugees who have been discriminated against on the basis of their religion, ethnicity, or national origin. And I, Jay Griffith, am an explorer of ideas and a facilitator of dialogue and relationships. I co-founded and manage the monthly discussion groups Faith Again and Think Again. I'm a designer, art director, helping create and market brands, products, and services. Other passions include trail running, writing poetry, reading about just about everything, being in and preserving nature, and striving to artfully live. I serve in a Latter-day Saint African refugee branch. My wife and I are in close familial relationship with 3 grown children, 2 daughters-in-law, 1 grandbaby, 2 cats, an old dog, and 3 chickens. Now we will go to the pre-recorded part of this session. Thank you.
I'm Andy Pitcher-Davis of the Dialogue Foundation Board, and it is my pleasure to introduce this session with a few words on behalf of the journal that Dr. Eugene England founded 54 years ago, serving as its first editor. Recorded on what would have been Dr. England's 87th birthday, this session details infamous communications between MIT and Stanford-educated Dr. England, who was a Brigham Young University professor of English at the time, and Elder Bruce R. McConkie, an apostle for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. These communications were painful for Dr. England and his family, and this session brings together Dr. England's beloved wife, Charlotte, with James McConkie, nephew of Elder McConkie, in moments of conversation and reflection. Dear Charlotte, on behalf of Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought, we'd like to wish you and your family a happy Jean Day. We thank you for your voice, your contributions, and your sacrifices, both to the journal and your faith, so that many others could have a voice. As everyone acquainted with Jean knows, there was, and is, no such thing as just one England. The sacrifices and hearts of the England family were and are truly knit together as one. This was especially true for Jean. Listen closely to his life and words, his successes, devastations, his loves, and his sacrifice. Clearly, Charlotte, you are there along with Catherine, Jody, Mark, Jennifer, Rebecca, and Jane, all who echo throughout. Good luck today, Charlotte. We watch with you and we love you.
Jim and Charlotte, it's an honor to be with both of you today, especially on Jean England's birthday. And I want to thank Tim Chavez of Faith Matters for hosting this for us through Zoom. And thanks to Andy Pitcher Davis and Sunstone for facilitating this project. And the project being highlighting a little known event that happened some years ago in relation to a very harsh letter that Elder Bruce R. McConkie wrote to Eugene England. So I'm not going to say a whole lot. I just have a few brief questions, but I do want to start out with Charlotte kind of laying the groundwork of what that letter was about and how it impacted her and Jean and her family. So Charlotte, do you want to go ahead?
Well, I have a little chronological list here, and I thought it would help to put everything in place.
Okay.
So that, because it's very confusing otherwise. We had only been there for 2 years. We had come from St. Olaf and Kaysville, and we're very excited to be at BYU. And Jean was looking forward to being able to teach with the gospel principles that he loved, and he found some of that experience at St. Olaf College, which is a Lutheran college, but he had to be very careful about letting more of that go. So he was really looking forward to it and loved it. He was loving his teaching. So we'd been there 2 years by that time, that he was invited to speak at the flea market lectures that were held in the Varsity Theater. And this was in 1979, it was September. And he and there was the usual advertising that went out. There was in the school paper and posters around that told about the lecture and what it was going to be. And they were mostly, he was teaching in the honors program. And so they had honor students there, plus anyone else who wanted to come, other students of faculty that were invited to come. And the Varsity Theater was packed, and maybe anticipating what this new professor was going to come up with that was probably talked about already. So the night before the lecture, Joseph McConkie called Jean, and he had seen the advertising, and the title was concerning the progression of God. First, it was the Lord's University, and then changed it to the progression of God, and 2 ways to look at that notion. And so when in this conversation, it was when we had one phone, the landline. It was in the kitchen, and they talked for a while, and I could tell from just hearing Jean's side that there was something that Joseph was not pleased with. Anyway, our conversation after told me why. He said that his father wouldn't approve of his talk and what he was going to be mentioning there. And so at the end of the conversation, Jean said, Joseph, our students are learning to hear different viewpoints on topics, and how important that is to hear different perspectives. And he said, I'm inviting you to take a couple of minutes of my time, my speaking time in the theater, and present your thoughts on this. Mm-hmm. and not quite anticipating how that would go. I don't know how well. I don't think Jean knew Joseph well, but anyway, it took quite a different turn, and Joseph, and so Jean announced this to the students at the lecture, and said, "As you know, we hope we're teaching you to listen to other viewpoints on the same topic." And he says, "So I've invited Joseph, who's expressed some concern, and he's going to speak to us for a few minutes." Well, he did, and I don't know if he was trying to use his father's words um, or what, but he spoke very authoritarian, and then at times he did some personal kind of judging on Jean. And so it was a little bit surprising to the students that kind of, it was not very professional, in other words, and not very kind. As someone who had been offered that time there. So he thought, I guess he thought it would show his authority by mentioning that the blood of the prophets flows in his veins. And I thought, that was the strangest thing. I thought, why would someone have to say that? And so Jean got up and he thanked him, and he believed that he said, "I think you're learning something now about different approaches." And for us to have better understanding was the main thing, to understand why these things. Jean's, I think Jean's optimism and trust in people didn't prepare him for that kind of thought. And I thought at the time, just sitting in the audience, that I wonder if Joseph is going to do anything with this. I wonder if he's going to report this, or. So he did say one thing at the end. He went on to say that he realized he was putting himself in disagreement with the quotations that Brother England had used or would use in support of his position, and that he realized that disagreement didn't make either one of them apostate. And it didn't occur to me that anybody could be apostate for having a different opinion. So Jean was quite concerned, and as always, when somebody has a different opinion, he wants to talk about it. And but by nothing was said at that time, no letters or anything. By the next year, this was in 1979 of the lecture. Next year, in 1980, was the 14th Stake Fireside, where Elder McConkie talked about the 7 deadly sins, heresies, and that gave Jean more to think about, even because he realized that he had just been picked out as the number one. That he said, he's talking about what I spoke on, and it was, I think he felt that if he was going to, before he would speak to 14 Stake Fireside, wouldn't he approach him to discuss this and let it, calm it down then, rather than make it such a public thing. He thought about that. He pondered about it. He thought about what Joseph had said, and was very concerned. So by September of that year, let's see, the the heresies was in February or January. By September, Jean wrote a letter to Elder McConkie. He said, we're really trying to help our students to understand how you fit the previous prophets and leaders with a different thing, a different saying, a different expression, or to the present day ones. And how do you make that work in your testimony? And of course, so then we, by January, and he also, by January of 1981, we were in London on a study abroad for 6 months. And by February, one of Jean's colleagues called Jean in London. He said, what is this letter that Elder McConkie has sent out? And it's traveled all over. And Jean was stunned. I mean, it was just such a shocking thing. And he didn't know anything about it. But he was devastated that something that private had been sent out there. Later, he learned that it had leaked either from, and there's a letter he writes to Elder McConkie about that. But anyway, he didn't get the letter from Elder McConkie until May. And that was an even greater shock. And so he writes to Elder McConkie about this. And it was a devastating thing for our family. Our children were all there with us. And then, of course, the word was spreading, and students were, surprised, and thought, what could be the problem? Jean writes a very kind letter to Elder McConkie.
Charlotte,
I'm sorry?
do you want to just briefly kind of say what that letter said? Just so people that aren't familiar.
Some of it, he thanks him for listening to him.
So I mean Bruce's letter, just so people have a sense of, so they understand what
pretty much
troubling.
He's very adamant about how we should be teaching, and he said that he should be teaching by the standard works and using that as their source. And Jean refers to Brigham Young, and he uses the King Follett Discourse and a lot of Joseph Smith, where he talks about God progressing as we will progress eternally, and lays all that out in a really beautiful way. And then, but it was taken in a far different way. Both Joseph and Bruce, Elder McConkie, took it in a very different way, as if God was limited, and that would be like, we could worship an idol, or we could worship something else that didn't have these. And Jean uses the scripture that talks about God weeping, and that God had to be, we had those emotions. He has those emotions, and that he continues to have these feelings as for us as his children, and that he in his spirit could be progressing also, just as we have been taught that we will progress continually. And this was taken as both men that this is making him. What if God just decides he's made a mistake in creating us, or what if he made a mistake on something in and that he would just all of a sudden change this? And so it was taken very different than. I mean, it didn't make sense to me, and I'm not a scholar, but. I thought but that doesn't limit God, that expands him even more. And as we want to be too. And so Elder McConkie chastises Jean. And then he says, now I don't want to see this, anything in my letter that I'm sending you. I don't want to see it spread around in dialogue or something like that. It was very demeaning about, I think, intellectuals, because of possibly getting carried away with things that really aren't that important, and then they should just follow what he says. And he says, my duty is to teach you, to tell you the word, and your responsibility is to listen to it and be quiet. And so he thought Jean was going around spreading these kinds of things from what his lecture was about, and that wasn't the case. So he starts the letter out with, this will be the most important letter you ever receive, basically saving Jean's soul. And so it goes through. It's a long letter, and anybody can access it online if they want to get that. So it was a chastisement and almost a condemnation that he put on Jean, and it was heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking to him. It was shattered some of our children's trust in leadership, because the way they were used to Jean's method, which was if somebody came up to him with a new idea, then he would say, that's interesting, let's talk about it. And there was none of that spirit in it. And in fact, he tells Jean that when he received Jean sent his essay that he had written. He had sent his talk to him that he had written also when he wrote to him. And he said, I looked at this and I don't want to bother myself with controversial things like this, so I put it in my drawer. So it sat there for 4.5 months, he said, before I picked it up to read it. And I felt like, well, I guess I have to read this. So it was.
Said that, right?
Bruce did in the letter. So he was trying to make, I think, help Jean see that what he was writing and what he was speaking was not good stuff, and that it was wrong. So anyway, that came in May. Jean responded right away and assured him that he had he's not speaking it, he's not preaching it. And in the letter, Bruce said, there will be some, you must do exactly what I say. And so Jean wasn't allowed to write for a period of time for dialogue or be involved with it. It was pretty, it's like taking your very profession and your dedication and heart away that you put everything into. So that, and at the end of the letter, he said, you can, because Jean asked if we could possibly have an audience, to speak person to person. And at the end of the letter, he said, you can make an appointment with my secretary and we can. So I was talking to my children about the impact of this. And they're different. They each one has a particular thing that really remembered. One of them pretty much just dismissed it and gave, I don't trust leaders. I don't trust the church leaders, and lumped it in one sum. That was hard. Another one said, if my dad can go through that and still stay in the church, then I can too. And because they knew so many good leaders that they had met and had in our home, and another one said was kind of questioning things at that time. Anyway, they were all but two were in college by then, no, high school and college, and so it was confusing to them. They weren't used to it. I mean, around our table we could talk about anything, and Jean was open to discussion for anything, and always gave them, I think, really sensitive, careful advice if there was to be advice. And they all remember and they all know that he never spoke negatively about any general authorities. And none of them can ever remember any of that in our home, or especially from their dad, who was dealing with them, several of them over time. And what they hoped is they would be leaders like Jean is, and open to discussions and not judging right away. And certainly not, I remember he wrote an essay on spectral evidence and found this to be the way. So when some of them came back, and some of them were in college, and even over the years, people heard, oh, you're Jean England's daughter or your son. What was this letter that he wrote? And so that has gone, stayed with us all these years. And it was hard for our kids because they knew their father in a whole different way than what is portrayed in that letter. So they've gone different directions for some of them. Let's see if you have a question?
We could, Jim, do you want to share a little bit about what you remember about that period in those letters?
You mean when they were written?
Yeah, and where you were and what you were thinking and what you felt at the time. And
well, I became aware of the letter, and so I knew about it, and I knew about it through friends, and I knew that it was harsh and that it was demanding in tone. And because I had read what Brother England had said in some of his essays and had friends that knew him personally, and my own heart resonated to many of the things that he taught and said, it made me sad, because I always thought that it would be a privilege to meet in England. I knew about Jean England's father and his mother, who were so active in the church. I knew Jean England had been a bishop and a stake president. and that he had a reputation for being kind and considerate, and that his students loved him. And I always felt I would like to take a class, but the opportunity never presented itself. And so I had this sense of sadness and the thought in my mind, well, what if I met in England, and because my last name was McConkie, there would be a feeling between us of estrangement. And I didn't want that to be the case. And so time went on, and this opportunity came to visit with Charlotte. And prior to that time, we raised our kids in Salt Lake City, and some of Jean's relatives knew some of my kids, and these were second, nieces and nephews, and they came over to my house one day, and we were all sitting in the living room, and they introduced themselves, and I asked this young man who was related to Jean and Charlotte about who he was, because I was interested. And of course, I didn't bring it up, but again, I had this feeling of remorse and the thought, I hope that he hasn't been scarred by what my uncle said, and I can't really talk to him about it. He was a young man, and it just again made me feel like I would like to do something to express my love for this family and my deep respect for his teaching and thinking and the ability that he had to ignite the imagination of students and to make the ideas of Joseph Smith so appealing to young people.
Lovely. And so you were at BYU at the time or not?
Well, 1981, I'd gone.
No, you were gone. Yeah.
I'd gone by then, and I was back here. I just got back here. Actually, I was in Washington, and I'd just come home.
And why don't you share why you knew your uncle so well, just briefly?
Well, the McConkie family, like many Latter-day Saint families, and like Brother England's family, are close, and we had the tradition of having extended family home evenings at least once a month. And Bruce would speak to the family because he was a general authority, and so he was generally the one who pulled forth and talked to us about the scriptures. And so I knew him well. My dad died, and he took a special interest in me, and check in, and if I needed a blessing or I needed something, he felt like he wanted to make sure that things were right in my life and that I was getting along. And I knew his sons, and we'd drop in. This was long before we had so much church security, but we could drop into to 47 East South Temple, walk upstairs and see if he was there, and just knock on the door, peek in, and go in and say hello. So there was a wonderful sense of camaraderie and closeness with the entire extended family.
Thank you. Thank you. Charlotte, did you feel like you shared enough about how that impacted your family and how you felt at the time?
Well, there were just a couple of others. One of them pointed out that Jean looked at the bigger picture and didn't sweat the details sometimes. He saw he could see ahead, and his mind was just going constantly of a better way to communicate something or a better way to make something work, or so that was a constant on him. And they knew that they could talk to him about anything and not be judged. He didn't come up with immediate cures or fix it or things like that. They talked it through. Yeah. And probably one thing that kind of at first kind of bothered me. He says, I'm going to interview all of you every month or every couple of weeks, something like that. And they thought that was really a dumb idea, but it was really a great idea because it did help. Both sides were there. And then we could talk about that. Jean had sent a letter when we got back home. He realized it was the Tanners that had circulated the letter. Now, how they got it, he didn't know, but he wrote this letter to Elder McConkie to warn him that there's somehow people have leaked something from the church office building, unless it came out. And he just assumed that he had shared this with Joseph, his son, and that possibly it leaked out of Joseph's office. We never did know. And the Tanners got a hold of it somehow, and then they circulated it. And so Jean made a point. He does a wonderful defense of himself, that he does not do things that like Elder McConkie said that he does. And so I was so proud of him that he didn't allow this to bury him and hold back and not speak up for himself, because he did. And but he did it in such still a gracious way, and still kindness to Elder McConkie. He didn't want to have bad feelings with him. So he was just trying to warn him of there was some kind of security break in there. And Jean went along with what his request was and didn't speak out, didn't write on those topics. And when Elder McConkie died, he felt that he was freed from that.
Thank you. Thank you.
He questioned it a little bit.
Yeah. So Charlotte, now reflecting on the conversation when Jim finally did have a chance to meet with you, as he had expressed he'd hoped to it someday, and share his thoughts and love and affection for Jean and for your family. Tell me a little bit how that evening went for you and what you remember.
Well, I figured if Jim cared enough to contact me and want to talk about this, I thought that, first of all, that was a plus. So it took away the fear that maybe it was going to be more reprimand. I didn't think it was that at all, that it was going to be. But I was so grateful just that a family member wanted to reach out and clear the air here. And I think I told you, Jim, I said, I figure Jean and Bruce have had a few discussions. Both up there, and probably a lot better understanding.
I think so.
But I was extremely pleased that Jim and Judy came down, and you and Jay, and I just thought, this is the way people heal. This is the way people take away the vengeful or mean feelings and wanting to get even or anything like that. I mean, this is how bad things are made better. And so I feel very hindered Jim's family and for what he did. And I hope that I hope his family, I hope your family and members of your family, not just your own children, but others, realize what a good thing you did and the difference that that made.
Well, it certainly made a difference for me because I finally got to talk with an England and express my feelings.
And they're as crazy as you heard they were.
Well, I just felt this. I was apprehensive. Judy was apprehensive because the last thing I wanted to do was to cause any more hardship because I understood even before I came and even more so when we left how devastating it had been, the practical consequences and how I would have felt if I'd been chastised by an authority figure in the church that I loved and gave my tithing to and taught for, loved because of the ideas it taught. And so when you were so gracious and accepting that evening and even gave me signed autographed copies of some of the things that Jean England had written, it touched my heart, and it was a sweet, one of those a memorable experience in life that Judy and I'll never forget, and I'm personally thankful for.
I am too.
Yeah. I might say what I hope is the reproach Ma and Heaven. Bruce McConkie, I know from personal experience, had very definite ideas, and he had definite ideas on things that have become controversial at the turn of the century. Was there movement between kingdoms? Did God know everything? Was God progressing? And we lived in an age where doctrinal matters seemed to count more and were more hotly debated. We don't talk about these things today. I talk about them more, but I also know that Bruce was able to change his mind, and he changed his mind just as dramatically in the other direction. And so I'm sure, my hope is that they're the best of friends.
I think, I'm assuming that they are.
Yeah.
And, so, but I think we can learn from it, and Jean's eagerness to make things right. And when if you read his letter that he writes to him after we went back home, and it's wanting to do the right thing. It's wanting to do at the same time he had his deep convictions of what he felt his mission was, and that was to teach and to write. And he couldn't not write. It was, his mind is just going.
And his writing was so helpful to my generation and those that were thinking about these ideas. And the thing that I loved is that his approach was wide open and it was exciting intellectually, and it didn't feel like there was any cramping finality, but it opened up new thoughts and vistas and ways of looking at what Joseph Smith taught in ways that were electric and soul satisfying and contributed to one's faith and conversion. And so he had this spirit about him that we could benefit so much more from, even today. And I don't think we'd be in some of the boxes we're in if people like Jean England had been given a greater opportunity to be a voice for our faith and for.
I find a lot of things he wrote, 20, 30 years ago are so applicable still. And they even talk about them now.
And that's why I'm glad, Charlotte, that you're speaking, because you reflect that same gentle spirit of the Lord Jesus, and are an example to my generation as you talk about Jean's ideas, and which came from a mutual sharing over a loving marriage, And so never feel like we're not anxious to hear from you as well, because your life, when I spoke with you, one of the moving things was how your life exemplified the ideals of the Savior and what I wanted to be.
Well, my friends, we're out of time. Do you feel like you can end here? Are you comfortable with what you said, and we can call it good? I've loved both of what you shared in this conversation. I think it's very timely. Good time to hear, with all the political strife and everything else going on, words of reconciliation and seeing those actions, those things that Christ taught in action from both of you and through Jean's life. So appreciate very much your willingness to share this.
Charlotte, thank you. Judy says the same for your friendship. We love you.
Thank you. It was a good opportunity to look back. It was a little hard,
Yeah.
but
Not easy. Not easy.
Well, hello again, Jim and Charlotte. This is an additional recording of our session from yesterday, since we lost our question and answer time due to technical difficulties. So we really appreciate you again getting together and taking the time to share your thoughts from your heart. I was on, again, Eugene England's website, eugeneengland.org, and Rebecca England, your daughter Charlotte, has put together a really thoughtful kind of compendium or essay, I don't know what you'd call it, of these events involved in the letter. And she starts out with a couple of quotes that I thought were really good and bear on the discussion that we're having in terms of healing and reconciliation. So one of them is, we must truly listen to each other, respecting our essential brotherhood and the courage of those who try to speak, however they may differ from us in professional standing or religious belief or moral vision. And then our dialogue can serve both in truth and charity. So that's obviously a quote from Jean. And then on the other side of that, it was interesting. So Bruce that was 1966, and Elder Bruce R. McConkie in 1981 said, "It is my province to teach to the church what the doctrine is. It is your province to echo what I say or to remain silent." Again, that was Elder McConkie's response to some of the teachings that Jean had on God and the character of God and things of that nature. So one of the questions I have, Charlotte, since we don't have a live audience to ask questions, is going through this at the time. How did you deal with the pain and the difficulty of it, and the feelings of injustice, and the anger that you probably felt? What tools did you use, or how did you navigate that difficulty?
well, I guess I was perplexed. I mean, I was dumbfounded that this is really coming from direction from someone that we revered. I may not have agreed with all things, anything, but it was just kind of shocking to me, and I was angry. I was angry for um, Gene and the restrictions that were being put on him, like he had committed some kind of crime. And I just thought, how does this work in the church? How do you use your authority um, in that way that is such a personal reprimand without even having the conversation or without the person there? And it's just so different than what that I thought somebody in that position would do. And Gene was trying his best to follow his direction. And I just thought, to not write and to not teach, not speak, was just beyond what, it's like having all your tools of your profession and of what you were so heartfelt into, and to have that restricted or taken away, I I couldn't figure it out. I just couldn't. It didn't make sense to me. And
Charlotte, can you clarify? So was he not allowed to speak and teach at all, or just about
well,
the
at that
topics?
point, um, he was just to be silent and
Good.
follow his counsel, whatever that was. And then later, when it became, then he told you not to write on the subject or publish on the subject. And he, in the letters, he says, I don't want to see what I've written in this letter to be quoted in dialogue and things like that. So he didn't know Jean. Jean would never do something like that was, without somebody's permission to quote. And so it was. I think for me, I couldn't be a part of many of the conversations that Gene had when he was called in by a leader or general authority or state president or something like that. I got all this secondhand, and I just and it was hurtful. And Gene wouldn't really dwell on it a lot. He didn't come in and say, gosh, that was just horrible conversation I had with the state president or something. He didn't do that. I became aware of some things just because of the scheduling and what was going on in the English department at BYU. And so I had a dream one time. Okay, where I'm going through these huge castle doors, and in movies how they have, when a big door opens, there's this booming sound. It's it kind of echoes. It just tells you it's a very heavy door. So I walk through the door, and in this long, long room are all the general authorities sitting at a table. And I went up to the table, and I hit my hand on the table, and I said, I have something to say. That was all the dream was. And so I think I was feeling a real frustration that I couldn't go in and speak for Jean. There was one time that we were talking to President Kimball. He had called Jean in to speak to the First Presidency when we were in town from Minnesota. And they were talking on some issues about Udall in one of the issues of dialogue, and it's his family, and so he was a little bit, this is my family. I'm a little affected by that, and so, and then he turned to me and asked about Jean, what I thought about what was happening, and I said, all I know is Jean's heart is honest. And he never, ever intentionally hurt anybody. And I know he gets very energized by a thought or an idea that he wants to pursue or he wants to work out with somebody. And I just know he's not vindictive. He doesn't try to get back at anybody. And when there is somebody who really opposes him, he does his best to talk to them and to work it out, like he did in Palo Alto when a man, Brother Prisbilla, in front of the audience, the whole congregation denounced Gene on something. I can't even remember what the issue was. And so as we were going home from church, he said, I don't know what to do. And I said, I think you need to go talk to him. He said, I don't think he'll let me in. And I said, I think he will. He's very opinionated kind of person, but I think he will. So Gene went over and spent the afternoon with him, and it was beautiful. I mean, apparently they just became very good friends and home teaching companions. And I think that's the turn that it could take. So anyway, I was telling President Kimball that, I just know he doesn't try to stir up trouble. He's just trying to find truth and good answers. And he turned to me, he says, "You really love him, don't you?" And he really sensed what it was about. And, and I was thinking, I don't know how many years before that we had gone to him to counsel when we were engaged and kind of decide whether to go ahead and get married before Gene was going on his mission. And having spoken with Lowell Binion, who did exactly that, she stayed home and finished school and taught school. So, and he gave us counsel then, and that was to get married and let the other things fall where they will. But so he was really so kind and so understanding, and even though he had this issue with his relative in the dialogue issue, he didn't hold it against him. He understood, and he could see what Gene was trying to do. So there were a lot of ways that I was trying to deal with it, and sometimes I did want to go in at times and really tell somebody off, and
You did.
couldn't do it.
So it sounds like, Charlotte, that Gene didn't say a whole lot about it. Kind of kept it to himself a lot. So a lot of it came out more later on. Did it ever cause you to question your belief in the church, your testimony? Did it ever shake?
Well, I knew too many people that were just good people and dear friends, that had, and they themselves had gone through, some issues with in the church. But so I didn't want to quit it. I didn't want to leave. It was too much a part of me and too much part of Gene, and it was just a core part of us. And so I just thought there's got to be some way that we can come to some kind of understanding or some kind of sharing of some thoughts so that this doesn't have to exist. But when it got bad, and it was another administration at that point that there were people in the religion department who were trying to push him out because so they managed to, I guess some of them were on the committee that chose for Education Week, to teach. And so he was taken out of that. He couldn't teach that anymore. And then gradually, there were administrations, some in the administration who were trying to get rid of him. And he was told that by people in the department that were aware of it. And so class time was taken away from him, and he was told he should keep his office hours, but he would still get his salary, but he couldn't, and it was down to one class. And I was angry. I was angry by that time. And I said, "This is wrong. It's just wrong. And what do they got? What do they have on you that I don't know? possibly another life that I don't know about. It just, this is not you. So at that point, he had, we went in and spoke to one of his, what do they call it, the President's Council or something. And so the two of us went in. It was the first time I'd been in on any of these discussions. And
So is this BYU President's Council? Is that what you're talking about?
and very cordial, very cordial, very nice. We came in and sat down, and then it was small talk for a few minutes. And I said, I have a question for you, and I want to know what it is that Gene has done that you're pushing him out. I want to know why he's being treated this way. When I can give you hundreds and hundreds of letters from people and students and colleagues who have thanked him for helping him to stay in the church. And I said, I want you, if you can just show me a letter, if you can just show me something that tells me Gene has done some terrible thing, I want to know what it is. And he said, well, and he was very uncomfortable. And he tried to get out of it. He said, well, it's, you hum around and everything. He said, well, so I kept pushing him on it. I said, just tell me, show me a letter, give me something. And he said, it isn't what he's done, it's what he might do. I was so stunned. I couldn't believe the words I'd heard. I couldn't put it together. And I said, then I guess we're all suspect for what we might do, might say, might write, but haven't. And I kind of chastised him. I said, and he had a picture of a relative who was an apostle, and he had a statue of Christ on his desk. And I said, I assume that you have those things as reminders of what the gospel stands for, what we believe in. That these are images to just tell you to treat your fellow men and women in a Christ-like way. And I said, I don't see that here. And he was trying to make excuses and everything, and I knew I had to leave because I wasn't going to cry there. I could tell I was getting close to breaking down, and I was so concerned about Gene. And I just turned to Gene and I said, let's go home. This is not a good place. And so I left, and I just walked out. Gene stayed to kind of close things up, and so I went outside and out on the grass knoll there, and I thought, oh, I've just ruined every chance that Gene, if he had an inkling of a chance, I just ruined it. And he came out and he just hugged me and just said, he loved me, and how proud he was that I spoke up. He said, wow, I should have done this sooner. But so from then on, by that time, the president was getting him out, and he got the message from the board, certain members on the board, that said, yeah, we've got to get him out. So that was it. And things just kind of wound down, and he was gone. And
wow, that's quite the story, Charlotte. Now, was he tenured there at that time? Yeah.
And Gene, then by that time, he was looking because he met with President and Gene said, "Well, maybe I should try to get something at the University of Utah." And he says, "Yes, you should do that." And then the person who was at the University of Utah, who would have been in a position to possibly help him, was then let go. And so he knew he didn't have a chance there. So that was when UVSC stepped in and they wanted him over there. Lucille, and who was the vice president to Romsburg.
Okay.
And they took him in and immediately adopted him. He started a Mormon studies thing. He started a study abroad for theater, and he was made writer in residence and got a grant from they needed some money. And he said, "Well, I'll apply for a grant from the, what's the big one in the country?" Anyway, they said, "Oh, you'll never get a grant from them for Mormons," and so he applied and got it.
Mm.
And it was just really getting really stirred up when he came ill, and he couldn't do that anymore.
So how much time did he spend there before he became ill?
He was there in '98, starting then, and he in February of 2001 is when he collapsed.
Mm.
And then he was with us for 6 more months after the surgery, after the tumor.
You had a rough few years there, didn't you? Wow.
Oh, you might say it was a little rougher ride than we
Yeah.
asked for or wanted or anticipated, but we got through it. And
Very difficult.
but he all through that, even to the very last, he chastised himself. He said, I maybe I was, maybe I was being a lot of things. He was criticizing himself, and I just told him not to do that.
Good for you.
Oh,
So Jim, she would have been a pretty good defense attorney. You're an attorney. I thought she did a good job in that meeting.
It was marvelous what she did, and it's hard to do. And I think you can see why when I was at dinner with Charlotte and she spoke to us about the repercussions of this event. What happens when someone in authority takes a position and then it's acted upon by people who down the totem pole?
yeah.
And when Charlotte explained all of these repercussions being forced out of BYU, having the kind of discussion that they had with the BYU council and president, who I knew because he was in England when I was there, I shed a tear. And I thought to myself, what a remarkable devotion Gene England had to the very end remain true to his faith as he understood it, and not lash back at or fire back at an institution that had harmed him. And it was unfair. And my Uncle Oscar McCarthy, who Charlotte knows, she knows Oscar and Judy, said to me, "It's not a test unless it's unfair." And I can't imagine a test that could be more difficult for someone as committed as Gene England was to the restored gospel. You couldn't have done anything that would have hurt him more deeply than to have authorities attack his credibility. And I just felt it was a tragic situation, and it's one that's been repeated in the church too often with others as well. And I think we sometimes forget what Jesus said when he said, "You only have one rabbi, and I am your teacher, and the rest of you should relate together as brothers and sisters." And that's the ideal,
Mm-hmm.
but this was far from what Jesus hoped his followers, how Jesus hoped his followers would treat each other, in my view.
Well said. I think Jean not only showed a remarkable commitment to the institutional church and their authorities, but even beyond that, to what you referred to as Jesus' teachings and example and how he responded. I mean, he lived those words of turning the other cheek.
No question. And then so has Charlotte, and
Yeah.
it was overwhelming to me as I listened to the story firsthand. And that's what struck me about Charlotte and Jean England is how they had fashioned their lives in the footsteps of Jesus, and that is that's to be admired.
It is very much so.
It's interesting that how soon after he started dialogue, how the words, the gossip and the false rumors that went out. And I think once things like that get established without investigation, to know the person, to find out. I remember the first time that somebody came to us in Palo Alto, and dialogue hadn't been out very long, and they said, have you heard the rumors about you? And I said, well, we'd be the last ones to hear the rumors about it. And that was that we had left the church, we had started our own sect, and all of our children had left the church too. Of course, most of them hadn't even been baptized. So it was. I mean, the question I had was, how on earth do people make up these things to the degree of not even having met us, I'm sure, or even know who we were? And then the problem with that, it isn't like that happens once and that's it. But then pretty soon, any little thing that happens, and the red flags start popping up. And I think that, and then you really find out who will be willing to stand up for you or support you. And I don't know if you want to hear more, but I know.
Well, one of the things I remember you mentioned to me yesterday was that you had, I think it was some friends or somebody that maybe suggested that Jean sue BYU for some of the things that they were doing. And do you want to talk about that? And Jean didn't want to go that direction. Can you share about that?
He didn't want to because he said that woman draw attention that would do harm. There wouldn't be any advantage to it. And even though he probably, and Jim, you could say he probably had enough stuff that he could have sued, but what just didn't have it in him to do it. And I'm glad he didn't, because I just don't think that, where do you end up after that? If you didn't have support or belief from your leaders or any colleagues or anything, what have you got? What is there? And so, and I think the tests that they claim that we're supposed to go through, I don't get that either. And I don't think God gives us those tests. We managed to do pretty well ourselves for coming up with enough of them that we do enough harm. But there was one that I really tried to stop Jean from having to respond to. And that was when the student sent the letter to the First Presidency.
Tell us a little bit about that. So it won't be
Well, it was the end of the term. And one of the things that Jean always started his class with was, and you're in literature, and it was a Mormon lit class, and you want to expose the kids to some good literature, and some of it can get a little controversial, but very good literature, just as like the Bible. If you took out all the bad stuff in the Bible, you wouldn't have much there, but you learn something from it. So anyway, Rick always gives the invitation at the beginning of class. He said, there's anything in this class that I teach, you have to read, or anything. And he did the same thing when we were on study abroad in London. He said, I learn as much as I can about the plays that we're going to. And if any of you feel that you can't go to that play, like when King Lear goes mad and he's hardly clothed at all, and he said, we'll work out something where you can read it and report on it, or if there's anything in class that said or that you're assigned to that you don't feel right about to study it, we'll talk about that and we'll work out something for you. Always ready to accommodate the student, at the same time helping them learn some of the things they're going to have to understand about literature if they're going out to other universities after this. If they're going for higher degrees, they can't just be, naive that much. And anyway, the student, after the grades were in and the student had written this letter, it came down. Okay, what do you usually do? What is the direction we're given when you have that situation? What's the first thing we're told to do? Go to the teacher. If they can't take it, resolve it, go to the department head, and then you go through. The letter went to the First Presidency. It came down. I don't know how many red flags went up, but the student was accusing Jean of teaching pornography, and it came down, and Rexley was president, and he sent the letter with the student's name blocked out to Bert Wilson, who was department head at the time and knew Jean better than anybody. He grew up with Jean as a child all the way through Downey, Idaho, and now as the department chair. And he was so appalled at how this had been handled. It was totally out of what the church has taught about resolving issues. And by the way, and in the letter, so he had to give that letter to Jean, and the assignment to Jean to write a letter to this student. And I said, Jean, that's impossible. How can they ask you to do something to an invisible person who won't even declare themselves, who won't face you? What obligation do you have to that? He wrote the letter, and he did tell them. He said, "This is really contrary to anything we're taught in the churches for procedure to take care of an issue." And I said, "Don't write the letter. You don't need to. This is not your doing." And Bert writes a letter to Stan Albrecht, and it's a beautiful letter. And he goes through all of this about the ratings that Gene's had in his class. They're top, they're more than the departments had, more than the schools had for student approval and what they've learned and tying in the gospel with the lesson. All of it was in there. And so anyway, he talked about Gene and Gene's character. He said, even as a kid, when we played Tarzan in Downey, Idaho, swinging from his grandpa's barn from one place to the other, running around in their shorts. And he said, even when it was really popular on the farm and around in a little town like Downey to use language that was rough, and Gene never did. He said he just never did. He says, I think basically he's just good. He's just basically good inside. And so that went out. That was pretty devastating.
Was that before or after the letter?
That was after.
Okay. So he already had kind of a mark on his name.
Yeah.
That
No,
didn't
and you know, and you know, who cared anymore? You know, I thought they don't care, no. And except they did, you know. I mean, Bert was right there, but you couldn't get people that Gene had talked to over the years. And in fact, one of the general authorities, and it's in the letter, said, "Haven't we saved him enough times?" And I thought, what kind of thing is that? You know, when do we start giving up on people?
well said.
So,
Jim, do you have any reflections on any of that or thoughts?
Well, that's a story that strikes near and dear to Judy and my heart, because Judy was a teacher and was called in by a principal who later became a church leader and was accused of being a communist because in her English class she was teaching poetry written by African Americans, and was called in and told that she was talking about too many ideas and that she should just teach them facts and let other people teach them concepts. And when she taught her classes in art history, she had teachers, Charlotte accused her of pandering and pornography. And it got to the point where she had the students take a contract home to their parents and just simply say, if you're offended by nudity, your student shouldn't be in this class, and I want your signature that you're comfortable having your student in this. And I think, you know, when we look at issues like this, like racism, whether it's fear of intellectualism in the church or fear of charismatic teachers that are ahead of their time, you know, time passes and they're vindicated. And I think that's what's happened with Gene. Time passes and he's vindicated. And people's attitudes change. And I would hope that this wouldn't happen again today, that we would be less likely to kind of devour our own when it's so unnecessary and unchristian. And the only other thought I had is that you're certainly right that isn't the way the scriptures teach us to talk about our differences. I was thinking of the 42nd section of the Doctrine and Covenants that says if you have aught against your brother, go to your brother. Mm-hmm. That wisdom was first in the New Testament when it was taught there. And to skip that whole process, which the Lord felt strongly enough to talk about specifically, we do that at our own peril, and bad things happen when we don't try and follow those fundamental teachings.
Thank you. Thank you. Jim, I had another question for you. You know, I can't think of any other general authorities we've had kind of in the mold of your uncle, Bruce. um, even before or after. He was quite unique. What you had a chance to kind of spend quite a bit of time in your younger years growing up and throughout your life until he passed away with him. Do you have any ideas kind of what helped make him who he was? And because I can't imagine he had ill intent, but at the same time, as I can reflect on my own life, I thought I was doing the right things, and then looking back, I erred pretty greatly and realized I hurt some people. So, what have your thoughts been in terms of his personality and who he was, and how how he got to where he was in
I
terms of
actually think of a number of general authorities in our history that were quite a bit like Bruce McConaughey. Joseph Fielding Smith, for example,
his father-in-law?
Jedediah M. Grant, and others, and who were very dogmatic on certain kinds of issues. And we've gone through these periods in the church, whether it's the Mormon Reformation, I don't need to define that, it take too much time, during the time of Jedediah M. Grant, or whether it's the debate over evolution in the church that takes place at the turn of the century. And at the turn of the century, we were debating whether we could move from kingdom to kingdom and whether God knew everything or didn't, or was progressive in knowledge. And these became hot button issues. And general authorities in the church took sides, and B.H. Roberts and Talmage and others agreed with Eugene England. That's the other thing that is so ironic and so unfair about this, is that he was articulating a view that was well articulated by Hiram Smith and Brigham Young and Lorenzo Snow and John Whitsoe and James Talmage. And then there was this other camp that was competing for the soul of Mormonism, as it were, and Bruce McConaughey and Joseph Fielding Smith and others who were in that camp. And so they had these eyeglasses on that there was a right and wrong to these issues. And I think it created an atmosphere where they felt they wanted to have a particular answer on a particular doctrinal issue. And so what did the church end up doing? Well, on the issue of evolution, they didn't take a position. And when I teach CES and I tell that to people, they don't believe me because we have people that have spoken so loudly on the issue that it's drowned out the official position of the church. On the issue of moving from kingdom to kingdom, that's the only one that I know of that recently, when I say recently, in the 1900s, where they wrote a letter and said, don't let the high priest quorum talk about these issues. Do not talk about that issue. It's causing too much contention and ill feeling in the church. And on the issue of does God progress in knowledge, the church didn't take a position. And you know that because when you read the Encyclopedia of Mormonism, it tells us that there are two positions. And so when we become so committed to ideas that we're willing to harm our brothers and sisters, then we are entering contention. We're entering a zone of contention. And we know what the Book of Mormon says about contention. It's of the devil. And so we need to avoid it, and we need to be kind and considerate and think about ideas without letting them become flashpoints for accusing each other of things. So I have those are some of my feelings.
So thank you, Jim. We haven't had anybody like that since Elder McConkie, though, that I can think of, that in that kind of strong. I mean, again, he wrote Mormon Doctrine, which the first presidency wasn't.
I think Elder Oaks is in some ways like Bruce McConkie. He has a position, he takes it, and he articulates it, and he advocates for it. And I had one experience with Bruce that was moving to me after the race issue. And we changed in 1978, and we had our first family home evening, and we were all kidding him and teasing him about all of the things he had said about the blacks are never going to get the priesthood, and don't you remember what you said in Mormon doctrine? And gee, you told us last year that this would never happen, and he took it pretty well. It was he was pretty good at taking a tease and the family. And he finally said, "Okay, listen up. I want you to hear this." And he said, "Everything I ever wrote, everything I ever thought, everything I ever said on that subject is wrong. I repent of it. And this is a new day." And he turned on a dime because of the experience he had in the temple during that revelatory moment in the church. And I think that there's an opportunity for all of us to do that on a number of different issues.
That talk really touched Gene. He was really moved by that. And
I was glad to see him just be able to say, "Okay, I'm wrong.
yeah,
And I don't want my family to try and defend me on that. I'm just repenting."
yeah, that's greatness, I think.
Yeah. I think some people are more prone to be more participate in advocacy and feel strongly about things and kind of steamroll. It's a sad thing, and I regret it.
Yeah.
In terms of, go ahead, Charlotte.
Well, I had to be careful to not judge people when they quoted some of those really harsh things that your uncle had written, and not judge. I just want to go, wait a minute, we don't have to do that. We don't have to quote that. Oh, golly.
It seems like the further back we go in the history of the church, the harsher the comments sometimes.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't want to start on Brigham Young.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, I can see. Well, this is where the ones who are not in the church, and they're good kids, they're good for each other. They're good to me and everything, and they love their dad. And I just thought, I wish they could see what, and they know they saw what he went through, and I think it was just too much. And so I was going to take that someplace. I can't remember, but they asked me, how do you stay in a church that teaches some of those things? And I said, well, I just go back to what the basic gospel is, and they said, but there are a lot of good things in a lot of organizations. And I said, that's true. And I said, I hope you find one that's better than this and that does more for you than this did, if that's the case. And but I'm saddened that you're not teaching because you're such a good teacher. And Gina and I used to, when we traveled and saw our kids, and they'd be teaching a class, and it was just it had an energy to it and a wonderful spirit to it. And so, and you can't blame the people who they're looking at as making mistakes and justify their, they make their choices, and it's hard. It's hard to see some of that, and I just tell them, I said, the church needs you. We need you. We need people like you. If they have to, somebody who pokes in the ribs a little bit and brings out things that are true, and you research things when you teach, we need you.
Yeah.
But
I grew up in I grew up with general authorities around.
Oh
And I
my
used to
gosh, Jim,
talk about
that's
this,
hard.
and my uncle on one side was Bruce McConaughey, and my uncle on the other side was Joseph L. Wirthlin.
Oh,
And so I knew them both intimately, and they were like night and day. And I remember I was with my grandfather, Joseph L. Wirthlin's father, who was the presiding bishop of the church. And my father had died, and I was out there, and I was living with them in the summers, and they were helping me, and I was talking to him about my uncle Bruce and what he had said, and all seemed really interesting and right to me at the time. And my grandfather listened, and he was such a kind and loving person. He replaced my father in many ways. He
oh.
said, James, just remember that not everyone agrees with your Uncle Bruce. And it opened my eyes. And so when I teach CES with Judy, if we come upon these issues, I just say there are 2 points of view.
Yeah.
And I wish that had been the case. I wish that, because that's the truth. And I wish that all teachers of the gospel would recognize those kinds of situations and say, look, they're just 2 points of view.
Yeah. It's all about proving contraries.
Yeah.
And truth comes out from that.
It is. Joseph Smith. That's right. You quoted him. Right on.
It really, well, Jean had a great experience with your grandfather, Joseph. Uh, Joseph Fielding. No.
Oh, Joseph Fielding. Joseph Fielding Smith.
Yeah. So when he went to him because he wanted to know. It was before the blacks had the priesthood, and they were talking, and he said that I want to know in the scripture where it says they can't have it. And he looked, but he said, "You're right, it's not in there." And I said, "Gene, how could he not know it wasn't in there in the scripture, being a scriptorian?" And he said, "I guess it had never been an issue for him, so it did, I just didn't." He said, "But we were just taught that." And so they had this little, it was just a very pleasant thing that they had, where they were both searching for this, and well, I guess it's not there. I got a kick out of that one.
Bruce came to the same conclusion. President Kimball asked him to write a memo, and he said, take off your church hat and don't try and defend the church. Just look at the scriptures and tell me if our race policy is justified in the canon of scripture. And so he wrote a memorandum to Brother Kimball, and he said, the scriptures do not support the idea that blacks can't have priesthood.
Yeah.
And that was a lawyer looking at the evidence and not advocating.
Yeah. That's wow.
So when you both think of our current political climate, the things we're going through, what I mean, I've heard threads of lessons that we could apply, not only within our church, because we have people leading the church all the time too over some of these things and other issues. But politically, we're in a difficult time, and we, as a church, we have, as most faiths do, orthodox and more liberal points of view. If we were to kind of sum up some things, some lessons from this whole letter between these two good people and the difficulties it caused and the heartache, what would you say going forward that would help us now in how we're trying to grapple with some really difficult things politically and even sometimes in the church?
Well, I think we've got to ask some questions to ourselves, as Mormons anyway. I think we are really have to examine what we believe in. And if we believe in peace and love and forgiveness and all the things that we supposedly stand for in the church. I think we have got to somehow get rid of Jim was saying this, we have two sides to things. But if one side is so unwilling to give, either side, if they're unwilling to give either way, I think we're really headed for some pretty awful times. And it's hard to, this is where I guess it's hard for me to sit in church sometimes and think that this person is thinking just opposite of what I'm thinking of how these things are to go. And so I try to, and I love I love my ward, and I love another ward too that I like to go to because they're a little more open and they have really great Sunday school classes. But I think politics has become almost the religion for some people, and that they cannot allow themselves, no matter how bad a candidate is or how dishonest or whatever it is, they cannot leave that line. They can't cross that line. And I think Mitt Romney did a huge favor for us, even though he's getting roasted for it in his own party. But I thought for him to stand up and oppose what he thought was really an immoral man to lead us, and to be alone in that. I just wondered what went through his head. And all along, I'd hoped that he would stand up more times than that, And to me, I don't care what party you're in, but I think we have an obligation to search out, to read, and to study things, to have information that we can make decisions based on some pretty good information. And I think a lot of people aren't doing this. I'm afraid that we're in Utah. I think we're so connected to our politics and religion in the sense that they can't pull away from any certain ideology. And I can't imagine the papers Jean would be writing right now. love to have one. So I think I've never stood out and held signs or anything like that until that day I saw Mitt Romney stand up alone. And I called my daughter, who was in Provo, and I said, we've got to get together. We've got to show support here. We've got to, do something. So we all ran down to University Avenue down by the courthouse and held up a sign, hey, Mitt, good for you. And I thought, oh, wow, this is what it's all about down there. So, but I think you have to be not afraid of being a loner, to stand up for what you really believe in and speak up. And I think I'm guilty of not doing that enough. I think in class, sometimes we'll get somebody who's just so off to the side on something, but they teach it as gospel. And I think we have an obligation and a commitment I think we've made to stand up for what's true, and not that you have to stand up and yell at anybody and just say, I've been thinking about this, and I'm thinking maybe there's more to this than this. I don't know. There's just ways to do it, and I've had to be very careful because I get a little bit riled up sometimes. So I just sit on my hands and not say anything sometimes.
Thank you, Charlotte. Jim, what are your thoughts?
Oh, amen to what Charlotte has said, I grew up in England and I used to go to church as a teenager, and my bishop was a part of the Socialist Party over there, the Labour Party. And he used to talk to the congregation about how Fourth Nephi was the example of what we ought to be doing politically, and that is equalizing wealth and caring for each other in far more drastic ways than we've even conceived of in our own country. And then I've lived here, and I hear that capitalism is the way to heaven and what God really wants us to do. And I think the politicalization of the church is a very dangerous thing. I think it's hurt us. I think our reputation that we're Republicans, and that that's really the only acceptable party for Mormons to belong to, that damaged the church because it cuts off our access to a group of humanity, a group of people in our own country. It just cuts us off. Why would they want to become part of a group that are Republican Christians? And I think where this comes from is when we read the scriptures, we read them to find passages that support our own view, instead of reading the scriptures and asking the question, which I think we should be asking, how do the scriptures change my point of view, which is culturally driven? And read the scriptures that way, I think it would bring us to a greater unity of the faith. That's my thought.
I think we, as a church, I think we're so guilty in so many places with the history that we have. You know, how we treated Native American, how we treat blacks, and all this is coming down. And just somehow it's been justified, and Jean just always went back to all are like unto God, and that means all are like unto God. And that our job is to see that that's the case.
And as Richard Bushman points out, that's the first statement that we ever made that was official on racism in 1830 in the Book of Mormon.
Oh gosh!
Our first statement on racism, and look where we ended up.
Yeah, exactly.
And now we're back. We're back again. Thank goodness.
Well, we're just real troublemakers.
Well,
Let's face it. You get the blue ribbon for that. Oh gosh! But I love the company of that. It's just a different. I just think we were given our minds to exercise to death. You know, I just think there's so much there that we can, and within the church, and I think that's what Jean felt. There's so much to explore in the church and the scriptures and Joseph Smith's life and the Book of Mormon is, now that we're reading it. I'd never read the Book of Mormon all the way through. I confess. Use things all the time in mission, but I always pulled out King Benjamin or somebody that I just people that I just loved, and so with a friend I'm reading this. There's a young man who lives at our house that he's in the honors office at BYU. And has gone back for another degree in therapy because he wants to help. He's gay and wants to help the LGBT in the church. And he's got a book that's coming out that Deseret Book is doing. So anyway, I noticed that he would each night before he went down to bed, he would read the scriptures from this new assignment we have and write in his journal. And I said, Ben, I noticed you really study this every night. And he said, yeah, I do. And I said, I've never read it all the way through. Maybe I could join you on this. So we when he would get back from work and we would read we'd read a couple of chapters every night. And going through those stories, I said, this doesn't inspire me at all. People getting killed and fighting and just fighting for all these struggles. And he said, It's just like today, isn't it? And so I said, that's why it is. And then he said, now wait a while. In the next chapter, you get this wonderful expression of God reaching out to people. And it's true. And so I've learned to, I think when people say this book was written for our time, I think they're not looking at the wars and things. I think they're looking at the how they're going to be saved and they're going to be all these things. And I think, no, wait a minute, you got to take the whole picture when you take that. So it's been a real education for me, and I said, I don't know how, they say that people read the book morning and they just feel this wonderful inspiration. And I said, I see people that are pretty cruel. But as I go along and we get these really beautiful gems that pop out. And that's what God is. God is not the one who's doing these wars. And the people, say God did this and God did. I don't believe that at all. They did it themselves. It wasn't Him. He didn't put that down on us. We created this. We have this agency that we're misusing, and so.
I agree. God drops these angels drop the truth into our culture through prophets and inspired people, and then we foul it all up.
Yeah.
And the scripture is just an example of how a particular culture either accepted or didn't accept the love of God, which is.
Yeah.
Well, you do. We're about out of time. We've spent about an additional hour in just the Q&A.
Wow, really?
Wonderful. Some beautiful things were said and shared, so I appreciate it very much. But we probably ought to end around now.
Well, I don't know about this. I don't know. How do you feel, Jim, about this going out to?
I leave that up to you. My feeling is I honor you in any way I can, and if you're comfortable, I am, and I just enjoy talking to you, as you probably can tell.
Well, maybe we should just keep it for us.
I'll let you decide that.
I don't know. I'm afraid that in that hour I have divulged some things that I haven't made public before.
Well, so bad, but that's okay.
What is it? You think so? I mean, what kind of trouble can I get in?
At our age, I don't think we need to worry.
I don't think you need to worry. They can't fire you from BYU there, Charlotte, so you're okay. I think
tried not to mention any names.
No, you did well.
You'll
be able to listen to it, and you can tell me if
you what?
You will be able to listen to it, and you can tell me if there's something that.
Okay.
And I give you permission to censor me too.
I don't see any need for censoring. You guys were wonderful. I'm honored to be.
Well, my kids might disown me if they see this and they say, "What on earth were you doing?"
You're sharing your heart and your best thoughts. I think you did great.
Oh dear. Oh dear. Well,
thank you.
There isn't many people you can share things like that with. I wouldn't want it to do any damage.
I don't think there's any damage that we can do. I mean, we've got an attorney here. Do you sense any damage that can be done here, Jim?
I think our intent is to bless the lives of others.
Yeah.
That's our intent.
It's what?
To bless the lives of others. That's what we want to do as grandparents and parents and members of the church.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's what you both accomplished today. So thank you. And I know Andy Pitcher Davis is hoping to have more conversations with you, Charlotte, with others. So hopefully, this is kind of the first go at that, and you'll want to keep sharing. I think you've done well. I think you've done well. So thank you.
You're going to be my judge. There's hope for me.
Okay. Well, have a wonderful day, you two.
You too. Thank you.
Together and break some bread again. in our direction next time.
Love that. Thanks to both of you. God bless you.